This is my fault. This is the fault of the police. Because for 39 years now, I've done your bidding. I've done it rather well, actually. I'm rather proud of myself. I've locked up a lot of drug dealers. And when I've locked them up, I've put them in the court and they've gone to prison for a long time. But 2 hours after I've locked them up, behind my back, 2 more violent drug dealers have tried to take over the patch. And the most violent one has won. So then I go after the most violent drug dealer that's taken over from the previous one. And this is a Darwinian spiral of violence. Then we're quite sneaky as cops. We employ undercover cops and we employ double agents. And the drug dealers worked out that we don't employ people who are 13 and 14. So that's who they recruit to do their bidding. The people who deliver all the drugs that's wanted in London are principally under 17. And we've created that. We've created that because we've done your bidding. We are never going to arrest, I agree with Trevor, we are never going to arrest our way out of this problem. Of course the police have got a role to play. Of course we've got to investigate crime. And of course it's vital that the attacks on Lena and Kate's children are investigated to the fullest extent. But the cuts since 2010 have had an impact. There's got to be a grown-up debate about drugs.
Mike Barton, thank you for coming on to the From the Outside Looking In podcast. Like I just said to you off camera, I am an ex-offender with 42 convictions. That's because I was incompetent rather than the police being amazing at it in Slough. But no, I'm an ex-offender. I got arrested well over 100 times from an early age, in and out of young offenders. And if you told me back then that at some point I was going to be sitting down with the ex-chief of police of Durham, I would have just said, I don't think so. I don't think that's going to happen. But it has happened. And the reason it's happened is because I started doing these podcasts. It was me and my friend that started off doing them. He's quite busy now, so it's just me. But a lot of the stuff that we cover is to do with homelessness and drug addiction. The two usually go hand in hand. But even in so, just drug addiction in general. And before I'd even contacted you, I remember I watched it. I remember when you was on Question Time, and I remember what you said, and it was it was a profound thing that you came out with, to the point that it's stuck in my memory. And I said to my mate that's helping me out, if I could speak to anybody about the war on drugs, it would be this guy here that I saw on Question Time. And that was basically you in a nutshell, just saying that you see things like county lines and some of the stuff that's going on in the country today. You said that it's your fault, and what was the term you used? The Darwinian spiral of violence.
Yeah, when we lock up drug dealers, local drug dealers, then generally between 2 and 4 hours later, the new supply is already coming through. But there will be 2 or 3 different gangs vying for that territory, and the most violent wins. And when we lock them up, the most violent wins again, and that's the Darwinian spiral of violence. That's why sadly people die.
Do you know what as well? I mean, I don't know whether you'll agree with me, but I just think that this war on drugs and the violence that is created, and the culture of violence, and the sort of gang culture and the culture of knives, and this 12-year-old girl that just got stabbed to death in Liverpool the other day, it's not a direct link to drugs, but part of me thinks, has the war on drugs and all of this culture that we've provided, is that partly to blame for the levels of violence that we see in society these days, and things like that? And it's just, I'll say outright, it's only my opinion and you might differ with it, and that's what we're going to talk about. That's what we're doing this for. The war on drugs has been out for 50 years. I think the whole thing's just been an abject failure, and that it creates more problems than it causes. That I don't know why it started. I don't know whether the problems were that bad that they felt that they needed to have a war on drugs. I'm not that old. But I don't.
Well, John Ehrlichman, who was the disgraced former chief of staff of Nixon, who was President of the United States when the war on drugs was announced. He announced it.
Yeah.
John Ehrlichman says it was to create two enemies that Nixon could then campaign on for re-election.
Yeah.
One were blacks and one was long-haired student hippies. And so then in Britain, we copied that with the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, which is still on the statute books. And there wasn't a problem with Class A drugs in the United Kingdom at the time. We had a perfectly serviceable health approach to addiction to Class A drugs, where if you're addicted to heroin, you were given heroin by your local doctor on a prescription, and then the plan was to get you off. But we didn't have all of that surrounding criminality and hypocrisy that we've had since then.
Yeah. I mean, I think the main thing, because I used to, I had drug problems, and the main thing that I will say is that the law was never even on my mind. There was nothing about the fact that it was illegal that influenced anything that I did. Do you know what I mean? There was never a point where I was taking these drugs, and even when they were at their worst, there was never a point where I thought, oh, you can't do this because it's illegal, because it's my body, and I find it hard to take. Do you know what I mean? Does that make any sense? It was just the fact that it's illegal didn't stop me taking them. I mean, if anything, it introduced me to the drug dealer of the world. Do you know what I mean? And I started off just a bit of weed.
I mean, I've got to bow to your experience there. I've got to say, I've never taken an illegal drug. So
right.
I've taken drugs because I smoked when I was a kid, tried it, didn't like it, stopped.
And do you drink alcohol? Do you drink alcohol?
And I drink alcohol. I was out last night.
And this is the thing for me, and this is the thing for a lot of people that have had problems with both of them. I'm coming up to 10 months sober now, and it's taken me 4 years of trying to get sober of alcohol to finally get to grips with it, to the point where I'm comfortable now. I've stopped drinking. I'm not depriving myself of anything. I wasn't having fun. I don't want to drink again. Do you know what I mean? Whereas before, it took so long because I had to get to that stage where it's like, I don't want to drink again. But for me, there is literally no difference between any other drug that I've taken and alcohol. They're the same thing. Alcohol is just another drug, but it's a drug that I take in liquid form and I can buy legally. No difference from heroin, crack, cocaine. It's all just a substance that you put in your body to make you feel different. And that's the other thing that I've always failed to understand. I mentioned it on a previous podcast, and I'm keen to say that I'm not saying legalize everything else. Let's just take everything because we can drink. I'm saying I've never understood why drink is allowed. Do you know what I mean? And the others aren't. The others did. If there was no such thing in alcohol, if there was no such thing as alcohol in our society, and alcohol got invented tomorrow, mixing it with the other laws, would alcohol be legal? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think that's a valid challenge, and I think people like David, not experts on this, would suggest that alcohol is more damaging than a lot of the controlled drugs that are deemed to be illegal. And certainly because of it's consumed in such vast quantities and to excess an awful lot. It actually costs the UK probably more than any other misused drug.
I mean,
but can I just deal with that sort of? It's this illegal, legal limbo. Funny language that people get caught up in. So alcohol is illegal. If I give it to one of my grandchildren or one of my grandchildren who's 12 or 13 goes into a shop and buys it, that is illegal. So alcohol can be illegal as well as legal. And if my an aged relative is in a hospice and needs palliative care, then they will be given heroin. It'll be called diamorphine. And it's perfectly legal for the doctors to administer diamorphine, heroin, in those circumstances. So in those circumstances, heroin is legal. It's illegal if you buy it from somebody on the street corner, and sadly you can't guarantee its purity, and that's where a lot of the problems come from. So I just think that we need to be much more careful about the way we use language. So heroin's legal in certain circumstances and illegal. Alcohol is illegal in certain circumstances and not in others. So I think, and we've sort of got caught up, we've allowed the popular press and pundits to say, oh, well, these drugs are illegal, these drugs are legal. And it's not as simple as that. But of course, that doesn't cut any ice if people are writing newspaper columns. But I would like you and I, Ricky, in this conversation to be just to acknowledge that there is a complexity to the language and the concepts that is probably helpful to us.
Yeah, and it just in general, it's a very, very complex subject. Just, drug addiction, the same thing. Is being drug addict, is that illegal? Do you know what I mean? Should it be punished? I look at Portugal. I don't know a great deal about their system, but it seems like they've gone to a system that you were talking about at the beginning that we had before the war on drugs, where things were treated as a health problem. And I know that out there, they're having really good results at reducing addiction in general by just saying, right, let's stop treating it as a crime and let's treat it as a health problem. And just go back to your speech that you did on Question Time. I mean, where do you stand on the war on drugs? And, was there a point where you changed your mind? Because obviously, in fact, could we just go over your career? Because you were a policeman for a long, long time, I'm assuming, to make it to the Chief Inspector of Durham.
Yeah, so I was in the cops nearly 40 years.
Yeah.
I joined Lancashire in 1980 and I rose to Chief Super there, 28 years in Lancashire, and then I moved up to Durham to become a chief officer. So I was chief constable up there for the last 7 years of my service, left a couple of years ago.
Right.
But when I first joined policing in 1980, the Misuse of Drugs Act was only 9 years old.
Yeah.
And I can always remember in Blackpool at the time, there were 2 part-time detectives who were the drug squad. That's all we needed, because there was very little Class A drugs out there on the street when I joined. Our biggest problem was violence and alcohol.
Yeah.
It still is. And if you think back, 1980, so Afghanistan produces the vast majority of heroin that's on the market out there, 90%. And in 1980, Afghanistan were producing 90 tons of opium. Fast forward to when I retired, they were producing 9,900 tons of opium, which is a staggering acceleration. And the UK is the predominant user of heroin in Europe. So we had exactly the same number of cops using exactly the same legislation. 90 tons when I joined, 9,900 tons when I left. And how can you say that that policy had worked if there'd been such an explosion of drugs? And it was there because there's a demand for it, and clearly treating it as a law enforcement issue had singularly failed to stem the flow of those drugs.
Well, have you not created the drug dealer instantly by saying something? Like when they banned alcohol in America, they created the mobster, if you like, and prohibition and all that. I mean, was it the same thing? The war on drugs has all of a sudden created drug dealers that then push drugs that weren't being pushed on people in the first place.
We've got all sorts of complex rules in society about monopolies. So if the last 30 years, we've seen the big monopolies of former state controlled industries being broken up. So electricity has been broken up, gas supply has been broken up, telecommunications has been broken up, because the government recognised that having a monopolistic situation wasn't good. Now, we may not have a monopolistic situation with drugs, but what we have certainly done is handed the monopoly to criminals.
Yeah.
Who are venal, no rules, there's no quality control, And of course, it's all fueled by debt and violence,
Yeah.
and creates untold misery and costs the country a fortune. And yet, somehow, and I don't know what happens to senior politicians when they get into government, they somehow lose their nerve. So David Cameron famously or infamously, when he was leader of the opposition, said, I'm going to do something about drugs because this can't be right. And then when he became prime minister, he absolutely disavowed that approach, even though he was in partnership with Nick Clegg, who said he was going to do something about it as well, and he didn't either when they were in the coalition.
Yeah,
so the one thing that I did as chief constable, I said, if I am going to be in a position to do something about this, then I will. And there's absolutely, I get fed up when people are retired this and retired that, and somehow they start coming out with all sorts of wise words about what should and shouldn't have happened when they were in power, but they didn't do anything. I did not want to fall into that trap. So I made sure that as a chief constable, when I had something to lose, a reputation to lose, a position to lose, I made it really clear to the public what we were going to do. And my elected boss, sadly died now, Ron Hogg, the Police and Crime Commissioner, made that very clear with the public. And when he was up for re-election, he more than doubled his majority. So the public clearly like this. So I don't understand what happens in government when people say they're not going to do anything about it. And I get dreadfully fed up with the Home Office's myopia.
What government? I don't know who it was that was in charge when they appointed the drug czar, and I can't pronounce that word properly. I forgot the drug czar. And within weeks they sacked them because they came out straight away and said cannabis and ecstasy aren't as harmful as alcohol. And the government were like, you can't say it. And so, well, why have you put that? Because he's an expert. It's the same guy that's now pushing for psychedelics to be relaxed a bit so that they can be used for medicinal purposes. Because he's saying that the laws that there are stop him even being able to, to study them. He's not even allowed to just have a look at them and see what benefits are. And I know that they appointed him, and he came out, and I know it was cannabis. I think it was ecstasy as well. He came out and said that the harmfulness of them isn't as harmful as alcohol, and they sacked him straight away.
Well, they are harmful, but only because they're illegal. No, only because they're illegal,
right?
And you don't know what's in them. So we've. I worked with a really clever woman called Professor Fiona Measham in Durham, and she's, from her own pocket, she's created all this testing at music festivals where people can go and get their drugs tested. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, so we decided to experiment in Durham city centre. It's a student city. So we did exactly the same procedure as at a music festival in the city centre of Durham. And what we found was there was a staggering proportion of people who were taking the drugs in there who said it was one thing, and we found out it was something else. It had been adulterated. So well over half the drugs were missold and misidentified by the people. So they don't even know what they're putting into their bodies. And that's one of the big problems for me, that drug takers who are taking drugs, because it's an illegal market, don't know what they're taking. When I'm taking paracetamol or some other drug, then I read the packet, I see the dose, it's all sealed. At no point would I take those drugs if they'd been stuck up somebody's backside to transport them to my house.
Yeah, another point that somebody asked me to raise actually is the fact that we've just, obviously the forces have just pulled out of Afghanistan. I'm in the forces, so this is a bit of an interest to me. I'm Royal Navy, so I've never been in that sort of frontline position. But we've just spent 20 years in the country, and apparently it was to stop the flow of this and stop the flow of that. And at the moment, the UK is awash with cocaine. Are we the biggest users in Europe for cocaine at the moment? I'm pretty sure we are.
Yeah, cocaine doesn't come from Afghanistan, though.
No, it doesn't. No, it comes from Colombia. But I get, my point is that all these things that we do in the war on drugs, they just don't seem to work. Like, do you know what I mean?
Well, I think you've got to say that there are certain indicators of how much drugs are available in this country. One of the most accurate is the testing of sewage.
Right.
And what the testing of sewage in major cities shows is that the supply of drugs is actually going up significantly.
Right.
Another indicator is price, street price, and that's certainly not going up. But what we tend to do is, in this country, and this is all part of that myopia, that bureaucratic governmental myopia, is we say, oh, well, look at how much drugs the police have seized. Aren't we doing well? And, we'll be seizing a few kilos here and a few kilos there, but it is absolutely a gnat's whisker compared to how much drugs are coming in here. We're awash with the stuff, and we're just not stopping any of it.
No. So, what's the solution?
Well, it's complicated, that's for sure. And,
yeah, it is.
People will say, what we proved, Ron and I, when we were in Durham, and it's carrying on now, is that you can actually run a very good police force and make the public safe and feel safe and reduce crime by taking a grown-up approach to drugs. So there's been plenty of evidence out there for the last 30 years that if you send somebody to prison for less than 12 months, you make their lives worse and you increase the chances of them being reconvicted. Just look at you.
Yeah. So just while I jump in quickly, I'm a perfect example of that because I got arrested. It was just a constant stream of arrest. Short, sorry.
It's called a revolving door, and I mean, it's fantastic, Ricky, that you've pulled yourself through. But gosh, you and your family went through hell.
Well, just for me, like I don't know, everything just seemed to be backwards. It's like what you were saying. I was at the time I was homeless for most of it, and I was getting arrested. I was getting remanded for a few weeks, coming out of remands, back to the same thing. The sentences that I got were very short. I didn't spend a long time. I got remanded more than I got sentenced. I think I did 3 sentences. The longest one was maybe 12 weeks, I think. But again, it was just there was as much as it's all good and well just punishing me with all the stuff that was going on in the background. There came a point where actually, once we got a few years down the line, a solicitor stood in front of a judge and just said, "This, what are we doing? Like, this guy needs a bit of help. Otherwise, we're just." Doing like what you just said, you're just causing him the same problems. Like there's going to be no end to this. And then what they did is give me a 3-year probation order. What that did was, got me access to other people, other organizations. And then from there, the probation office were like, go and do Fairbridge, which is outward bounds activities, which I know gets bad press off some people because they assume that we're being rewarded. And actually, it was all about personal development, taking a look at yourself, working as a team, etc., etc. Once that was in place, I then started progressing in life. By 21, I went off to Africa and volunteered for 3 months, changed my whole mindset on the world, realized there was actually a big world out there. I got arrested one more time after that. And I remember when I got arrested after that, my circle of friends had changed a little bit because it was people that I'd met in Africa that were gap year students who then went to Newcastle University. So I was hanging around with a lot of students that, some of them were from privileged backgrounds. They'd never been arrested in their lives. They didn't know. I remember when they turned up to the court, one, it was a little day out for them because they weren't, they'd never experienced anything like that. But I also remember that for the first time ever, I had friends that were genuinely disappointed in me and were saying like, what are you doing with your life? Like, why have you, it was such I punched a bus driver drunk over nothing. Do you know what I mean? But for the first time, I had friends of mine saying, what are you playing at? Do you know what I mean? And all of a sudden things changed, but all of that started because everybody stopped just throwing me inside for a few weeks, which is the easy option. I think sometimes the courts they see that you've gone once and then they just think,
and also not allowing you coming out with those trite, easy excuses. I was drunk, I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
So, because actually, restorative justice and not putting people in prison and giving them probation and getting them to confront what they're doing, is tougher than just sending somebody to prison.
Well, also
and letting them stew in their own self-pity.
Yeah, one of the things I had to do was a challenging offending behaviour course, which sounded noddy at the time, and like you're just going to tick a box. But actually, they sat me down and what they said is when something happens and you lose your temper and start fighting in the middle of the street, who is it that actually ends up like with the negative of that? Is it the person that you're fighting or is it you? And I was like, yeah, eventually it took that to make me think, actually, it's me that suffers when I do this. Do you know what I mean? So I do get it. I do, prison, you get some people that throw them away and throw them in prison and lock away the key, and that doesn't work. So
it worked.
I'm not saying don't send anybody to prison, by the way. I'm not saying don't send anyone to prison.
Nor am I. It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
But what I am saying is don't send people to prison for less than 12 months.
Right.
And that may sound utterly radical, but I stopped as a chief constable, I stopped prosecuting people if I thought they were going to go to prison for less than 12 months.
Right.
And what we did, we put them in something called the checkpoint program, which is a bit like the program you were talking about there, where you challenge people's thinking. So it's all based around restorative justice. You actually get to understand the harm you're causing to victims, as well as the harm you're causing to your family and yourself.
So just quickly, so when you say that you stop prosecuting people was that a case of you think everybody that gets in trouble should go to prison for 12 months at least, or do you think that if their crime isn't serious enough to warrant 12 months?
I don't think everybody should.
Well, I'm just clearing it up.
If people need to go to prison, and there are some bad people, and probably, some of the things that you've done, I mean, if you've smacked one on the nose of a bus driver, especially if he was driving at the time and there's people in the bus, then as far as I'm concerned, I think I might give you a bit of porridge if I was the magistrate.
Well,
no offense, Ricky.
No. What I will say is it was clear to me. It was made very, very clear that was my last chance, and any more trouble was going to. It was clear that any more trouble was going to. The sentences were going to suddenly become long.
Thank goodness you listened, and you had a social milieu that allowed you to walk out of that, and you joined the Navy and gave structure in your life. And
much later, but
but I mean, it was all part of a journey that you went on to understand that you're part of society, not an outsider feeling sorry for yourself.
Yeah,
and I think when it comes to prison has a part to play. It's become poor Johnny one note. We've got this one note, and that's what we're going to use. It's like we've got a hammer, so everything looks like a nail. And what we should really be doing is understanding, how do we reduce reoffending? That is the question.
Yeah.
And so that's what we started doing as a group of people in Durham. How do we prevent these people reoffending? Now, sometimes that would mean that they went to prison for quite some time, but we would always work on them while they were in prison. So something like restorative justice, if it was appropriate and the victim wanted to do it, we would take the victim in to see the offender, to challenge the offender about their patterns of thinking. And at the same time, the great thing about restorative justice is it gives real confidence to the victim, because of course these people who were your victims weren't robotic. It changed their lives sometimes in a big way. And so one of the things that we want to do with restorative justice was to give a voice to the victim, who is often airbrushed out of the criminal justice process. So not only is it harmful to the offender, especially if you're sending them to prison for less than 12 months, but it's hugely harmful to the victim, because they don't get any satisfaction from it. And if you actually do surveys of victims, the longer they're in the criminal justice process, so if it's a long, drawn out process, the less and less confident they are, and the more and more they sink into depression and other related issues. The more that you give them restorative justice, which is access to the offender after justice has been done, we were getting high 90s satisfaction with victims with all of the processes we got involved in, by not be slavishly simply arresting people, interviewing them, finding the evidence, throwing them before the court, and then forgetting about it. So we proved that you can actually be therapeutic in what you do as a police force, rather than just punitive and making things worse. And of course, the vast majority, or a significant proportion of those offences that we didn't prosecute, were drugs related or alcohol related. So what we did was, if we're not going to prosecute you, it was called a checkpoint program, and you can research it and even talk to the people who designed it, and it's still going on. It was fully researched by Cambridge University, and we proved with a randomized control trial over several years following people that we reduced reoffending by 30% which is a staggering figure that completely bowled the researchers over.
Yeah.
And the reason why we were able to reduce reoffending rates like that was because we challenged the behaviour. So if you were on, let's say we locked you up, Ricky, on the, and then we said, right, we're not going to prosecute you. We're going to put you into the checkpoint program. So it was a 4-month program where you had to promise to do certain things. And the first one is, I will not commit any more offences. And if you do, we'd just prosecute you.
Yeah.
The second one was, I will engage in restorative justice with the victim if that's what the victim wants. And then the third one, if you were addicted to alcohol, you're going to go on an alcohol program. And if you're addicted to Class A control drug, you're going to go on to Narcotics Anonymous or whatever. And that would be the deal. And as a result of that, and we were supporting people to do that. So you'd get somebody called a navigator who, and navigators had about 30 clients at any one time. And they'd ring you up in the morning, right, you've got an appointment today, Ricky, we're going to call around and we're going to pick you up and you're going to take you there. Because people find all sorts of excuses when they're in that cycle of offending, where they just don't go to appointments. They just get back underneath the duvet or their mate's couch. And there they are.
I used to forget. I used to just genuinely, just because my life was so chaotic that all of a sudden I would think, I had a probation appointment 2 days ago, and it wasn't that I meant to not go. Just I wouldn't say.
And then you're screwed once you miss your appointment. You're in breach.
Well, probation. I tell you what, probation changed while I was sort of involved in it. Probation changed that when I first had a couple of short probation sentences, it was very much, it was up to the probation officer with how they dealt with stuff. So, if I missed, I remember I was down in Bristol, I missed a couple of appointments, but the probation officer I was dealing with there knew that I was homeless, knew that my life was chaos. And when I got in touch with her a couple of days later and said, look, I'm sorry, can I come in now? She was fine with that. It then changed to, it was taken out of their hands. If I missed an appointment, they had to breach me. I spoke to a couple of probation officers that were really unhappy with that, because they were saying, we can't do anything. We can't look at things objectively now. And, I know that your life's chaos and I'd rather not breach you of probation, but I have to, because I've been told that if you don't turn up to one appointment, you've breached your probation order. And there was sort of no room for them to use their common sense, if you like. That happened for, while I was involved in it. So I saw that change.
I think that's a really important point, Ricky, that a lot of people don't understand, because the press feed this line to people that everything out there is woke and everybody out there is liberal in the criminal justice system and people can get away with this, that and the other, which isn't true, actually. The last 15 years has seen a real ramping up of taking discretion away from sentencers and people involved in the court process. I think the police are the last bastion of people who can actually use their discretion, which I did, of course, with Checkpoint. And what you find now, a lot of services that are in government hands now don't have discretion. So we had the crazy situation with one of our lads who wanted to get a job in London. He was on Checkpoint and he went down for this job application, and on the way back the train was late, so he missed his social security interview for unemployment benefit because the train was late, because he'd been going for a job interview, and they breached him and they took 2 weeks unemployment benefit off him. All the time. And we knew this then, because we had our navigators who were looking after these people. So of course they shared this information with us, and then we were able to go and try to negotiate with other government agencies to be that little bit more caring, because it was going to work in the long term. But I've got to say that I used to shake my head every day that the bureaucracy and the wheels of government are not oiled with humanity or common sense. And you just got these ridiculous situations where we were sentencing, we were committing people to just endless misery. And one of the things that I've done since I retired is get actively involved in a charity called Changing Lives, which cuts to the heart of what you want to achieve, Ricky. And with Changing Lives, it was all based around the Cyrenians 30, 40 years ago, which was all about homelessness.
Yeah, I know the Cyrenians.
Homelessness, addiction, getting people jobs, putting their life back on track. And any sensible society has got to be engaged in not only making sure that really bad people go to prison, probably sometimes for the rest of their lives, but also the people who are caught in those skirmishes of life and addiction. Let's think of something better than sending them to prison. Sending people to prison is not only wasteful if they go to prison for less than 12 months because they come out and they offend even more, but it's jolly expensive to send them. It's actually cheaper, I think, to send somebody to Eton.
Well, I know that it's more money gets spent on keeping prisoners than get spent on looking after kids in care, which is a whole different subject. And then from there, I mean, I've done a couple of things now. From there, I think like 1% of the population goes into children's homes, into the care system, less than 1% of the population. And then out of that 1% of the population, almost 50% of the prisons are full of that one people that have been in that 1%. So the numbers are just silly, where it's like, I mean, it's a whole different subject altogether, but there is a massive part of me that's like, well,
I know, but it's linked. Oh, it's all linked.
Yeah, it's all linked. You know what I mean? And there,
sensible people like you and making those links.
Sensible. There's going to be a few people that are going to watch this and say, "Did he just describe Ricky Gleason as sensible?" But that's a work thing. That's not in normal life.
Okay. Let's just assume that you've got an hour of sanity when you talk. So it's all connected, and we now know it's all about adverse child experiences. And these are all proven now by science that if kids under 10 suffer 3 or 4 adverse child experiences, it's something like the 25 times more likely to go to prison.
I am the perfect statistic. Literally, when I look at the statistics of things that happened, I tick every single box. I was in care, so there's the statistic that I'm almost certainly going to go to prison. The big one was I was expelled from school, permanently excluded from school before 14. The stat is the guy that did the study just said, he came out and said, you may as well, for a young lad, if you permanently exclude him from school before 14, you may as well be giving him a prison sentence there and then on the spot. The drug addictions, I wouldn't say it's a weird one with me because I've never been physically addicted to anything, but from the age of, I think 13, I've had nothing but substance issues all the way through my life, swapping one to the other, to the other, to the other, to the other, eventually settling on the one that I could buy legally from a shop and ingest.
And mostly you would be trying to escape the life that you were in.
Yeah, so it's a lot of people used to say, oh, it's about escaping. He just wants to forget. It's not. When you take it, well, for me, I can only speak personally. When I was taking drugs and drinking, I wasn't taking them thinking, oh, let's just forget about how miserable everything is. The problem is that I found this way. I'm not really thinking about how miserable everything is. I found this way to take something that gives me an instant feeling of gratification, which I haven't otherwise got in my life. Yeah. So it's not about forgetting. Yeah,
it didn't put you into another universe, but it made the life that you had a nice life to lead rather than a not nice life.
And then that was my. People have hobbies. That became my hobby.
And my sense as a cop was, it was much better to listen to people like you about why you took drugs so I could understand it rather than just imprint my own judgment and opprobrium on you because why have you done this thing? Because it's illegal.
Yeah, like drugs bad, you take drugs. Yeah.
So as a cop, I was always inquisitive. Why have they done this? I need to understand this. So if I see this situation before, I'll just have that little bit more wisdom to actually cope with it in a sensible way. So that's why we did it. So when we sat down with anybody who came into the checkpoint program, we sat them down for hours, just asking them what had happened in their lives. And sometimes our experts that were doing this because they weren't cops, they were drugs workers, teachers, probation officers, psychologists. So we had a whole range of people who were our signposters, our navigators who looked after people. And it was those conversations where we really started to get an insight into people's lives. And the other thing that we did with that is we reconnected people with their family and their friends who were helpful to them. Because generally, one of the features of drug addiction is people, because it's illegal and it costs quite a bit of money, people engage in criminality and steal from people to actually pay for those drugs. And of course, the first people they steal from are their family.
Yeah.
It's easy. If somebody's left the purse out of the wallet out or a tenner on the bookshelf, it's easy to whip it and go out and get a fix. So, and one of the problems with that is that family eventually disown people. So when we finally got people who had been addicted to drugs or involved in that cycle of drug taking, by the time they came to us and said, I really need help, and they recognized they need help, they didn't have that circle of friendship and help that you described when you assaulted that bus driver. So, and if you don't have that circle of friends, it's jolly hard as an individual for you to actually break that cycle. So one of the things that we tried to do was to try and accelerate people's thinking into, right, you need help, before they became absolutely rock bottom. And we also, in our restorative justice meetings, where we brought the victim in there to speak to the offender, we treated the family as the victim. So they have victimized the family. We want the family. And sometimes, I always remember with two separate cases, who had teenage children, and those teenage children came into those meetings and they told their mums a couple of home truths that absolutely floored those women. And it was those moments of clarity for those two women that turned their lives around. And also, more importantly, turned the lives around for the teenage kids who were living hell on earth. And, so I think that it's not just about arresting people, charging them, putting them before the court and sending them to prison, as a lot of pundits would say.
Well, yeah, and that's what you said in your thing when I forgot who was it. Trevor Phillips who you next to? Or
Trevor. Yeah.
When you looked and just said, I agree. Yeah, you're not going to arrest your way out of the problem, which that's for me is a big thing. Like, I can only look at it from the addict's point of view, but you can keep arresting me all you want. If I'm addicted to drugs, I'm just going to keep taking drugs. Doesn't matter.
And of course, if you've got a physical addiction or a psychological addiction, no amount of finger wagging by a magistrate or a judge is going to cure that. What's going to cure that is a medical approach, a therapeutic approach, not a criminal justice approach.
Which I think we've got, at some point, somebody's got to say, look, Portugal are literally, they're proving, treating it like a medical issue works, rather than just keep arresting people. Do you know what I mean? And with your checkpoint system, how comes, has that gone anywhere? Is there any talk of it going national or anything like that?
Well, yeah, a lot of forces took it on. It wasn't as widespread as ours. And of course, Checkpoint was actually based on the West Midlands Turning Point programme. That was smaller in scale, and they'd actually used police officers as the navigators. And that hadn't worked very well. So that's why we did not have police officers as navigators. Right. So we actually built on something that had already been proven to work. But what we did was we industrialized it. So we made sure that the entire force was doing it all the time. But we went through this 4-year program of randomized control trials to prove that it worked. Because I wanted people to say, well, why didn't you just do it if you knew it was going to work? Well, because I knew that the Home Office and politicians would try to say that it's not right, you can't do this, and people would try to tear it down. So the reason why I went through that 4 years of pain to scientifically prove it worked, so that people couldn't destroy it when I left.
Yeah.
And it's now industrialized across the whole of Durham and still working. And I can always remember, so when people say, oh, well, it's all very well, Durham's a sleepy part of the world. Are you kidding? The one constant that links two things is deprivation,
and
crime. So the biggest driver for crime is deprivation. Durham still, sadly, is the poorest county in the country because it's the Rust Belt. Hopefully they can turn it round. But so when people in some of the counties were telling me that I had it easy in County Durham, because I think one or two of their children had probably been to Durham University, and Durham City itself is lovely, but the rest isn't. So
I mean, because I'm from, obviously I'm from Slough originally, but I'm from the northeast. That's where I class as home. So I know Durham, and I know that outside of the lovely picturesque city centres, in a lot of the northeast are some of the most deprived areas you'll come across, and they're really, some of them are really nasty as well. Like,
one of the interesting things was whenever there's a general election up and coming or a local election, councillors and MPs become very, very active in their post bag to chief constables, because when they go on door knocking and they ask people if there are any problems, if there are problems with antisocial behaviour or crime, then they're going to be told about it.
Yeah.
And when I first went up to Durham in 2008, one of the local MPs was always on at me, and she was pretty insistent. And I thought she was a bit of a pain in the neck. On reflection now, she wasn't a pain in the neck. We were the pains in the neck because we weren't actually dealing with the antisocial behaviour that she was actually alerting us to. Anyway, so we started taking it seriously. So a bit like Checkpoint. So if there was anybody committing antisocial behaviour, we'd try and get inside their heads and work out what was really going on, rather than just finger wagging and giving them a fine or whatever. And at the last election in 2018, I think it was, before I left, that same MP came to see me and said, this is the first election where she'd been on the door knocker and nobody had complained about antisocial behaviour and policing failures. So that is another really powerful piece of anecdotal evidence that by not concentrating on this revolving door, endless cycle of locking up people who are addicted to drugs, you can actually start to concentrate on the things that really damage people's lives. And of course, the cycle of addiction of drugs, if people are offending to feed that habit, does blight communities. But if you actually put them into the health system so that we can actually deal with that addiction in a health way, as well as dealing with their antisocial components of their life, you can actually make communities much safer.
Yeah. Was there anything like during your time? Sorry, something's just come up on my computer there. I don't know if you heard that idea in my ears. Was there anything during your time that, was there one specific moment where you something horrible happened? I don't know. So did you see something that just made you think we've got to do things differently, or was it just a gradual accumulation?
No, it was an event. It was a series of events.
Yeah.
When I was detective inspector in Blackpool in the mid-90s, so how long was that ago? 25 years ago. I'd gone to one too many deaths of young lads. So at the time, young lads were sent to approved school, Borstal, youth offending institute, quite a lot, burglary, theft. And a lot of these lads were in Blackpool then were addicted to Class A drugs, or were certainly taking Class A drugs, heroin. And I remember two deaths in quick succession where I went to a public toilet, and they both were exactly the same, where 16-year-old lads were cradling the toilet bowl with a needle in their arm, and they were dead. And what had happened was, when they were in the Young Offender Institute, they were still taking heroin, but it was much, much weaker than what was on the street. So they'd come out and got their first fix, hugely powerful compared to what they'd been used to in the months where they'd been inside. And it killed them straight away because, of course, diamorphine, heroin, suppresses your breathing, and that's what killed them. So I saw these two kids who had died because, they were both thieves. They'd been convicted of burglary, but on the statute book, burglary is not a capital offence, and these two lads were dead. And it was at that point I said, this is crackers. We've really got to have a grown-up debate about drugs. And ever since then, I mean, obviously I was a DI, so I didn't have the voice that I had as a chief constable. But from the mid-90s, quietly and then more publicly, I've been very clear that it isn't working. We've got to do something else.
Thank you for doing that. Yeah. So what next then? What you're retired now. What is it that you're doing to try and help us out here?
No, you're kidding. No, my life is mapped out with Zimmer frames and being pushed around dribbling. I'm active with Changing Lives. I'm active with the Restorative Justice Council. I'm a visiting professor at the Jill Dando Institute at the University College London. So, there's plenty going on. I do leadership mentoring with kids at Durham University. And
so you still, so I mean, you're back in Lancashire now, aren't you, living wise? Or
I'm a bit like royalty. I've got 2 palaces.
Oh, nice.
I've got a house here and I've got a house in Durham. We got the house in Durham, of course, because I was living up there. But we just want to keep the 2 bases going while I'm a bit more active in the northeast. So I'm deputy lieutenant up there. I'm involved in the boys' clubs. So I like to really support some of the exciting stuff that I got involved in as chief constable. And I just want to put a bit back into society up there. So at the moment I'm living 2 lives, but I suppose when my joints really do start to creak, then I'll just retreat to gardening and reading books down here in Poulton.
Sound. But I think we're going to talk anyway, because I've got some stuff going on that's about to hit.
Oh, well, you've got some exciting stuff with the sport.
We've got.
I think that's really impressive.
Well, yeah, so we got the sports aid stuff that's sports trader that myself and the guy that you've been speaking to, Ian, we're spearheading taking that to the northeast. And again, do you know what a lot of that's about? It's just about inclusion, getting people involved in something, because a lot of the problems, a lot of people fall into drugs, obviously because of the backgrounds that they have, which we've touched on, the type of stuff that I came from. But then they get to a stage where there's nothing to channel their aggression into, if you like, do you know what I mean? Or just, their brain, there's nothing there. So yeah, we've got the sports trader thing going on. I think we're gonna speak to you about somehow working together. I think that's the key. I think, I was joking at the start saying that I can't believe that I'm talking to a copper. But actually I'm at a stage of my life where it's just like, look, if things are going to get better, everybody has to start working together a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think what I learned in my time in Durham was, if you give the support, the guidance and a bit of freedom to communities to help themselves, that's what they do.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of infantilizing people and treating them as inept and can't help themselves.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. But I do think that we are definitely missing a trick with young people. I saw a real diminution in the offer to kids growing up in the northeast while I was there. With austerity, boxing clubs were shut, youth centres were shut. We even at one point, about 6 years ago, became the biggest trainer of sports apprenticeships and youth worker apprenticeships in County Durham, and we were a police force. So it really did get to a pitch, and I don't think it's recovered yet. So I think the more that inspirational people like you can get involved in things like sports trader, where you're encouraging young people to get engaged in sport and giving them affordable kit, is fantastic.
Yeah, I'm big on young people. I remember being young. It doesn't seem that long ago, but apparently it was. But I remember how crap it was, if I'm being honest. You know what I mean? I remember how much of a struggle it was, and you know, I looked at other young people that their life wasn't a struggle. And even now I look back and think, oh, you know, I wish that I'd got to experience that, because being young is supposed to be fun, isn't it? That's supposed to be the fun bit of your life, really.
Yeah, and
for a lot of young people out there, it really isn't. And it does seem like it's made harder almost on purpose. You know, I still look at things like, you know, if young people are living on their own, like myself, until they're a certain age, they get less housing benefit than other people, and they're living the same life. And I'm like, well, why are you automatically making their life more difficult by giving them less money to get by on when they're living exactly the same life as somebody 2 years older than them? And there's a lot.
Well, you know why?
Pisses me off.
That's a direct result of government policy wanting you to live at home. But of course,
but you know,
it makes no provision for people who don't have a home to go to.
No, you know, some people haven't got that option to live at home. I didn't have that option from 15 onwards. So,
and my wife's worked all her life in schools, and one of the charities that she got involved in were the young carers. And it was heartbreaking. She was at a junior school, and yet there were more than a handful of kids at her junior school who were actually carers for parents.
Yeah.
And, you know, suffering from mental health problems, some with physical and mental health problems. But kids of 9 and 10 would be late for school because they were actually, you know, running a household as well as being in years 5 and 6. It's heartbreaking, and we should be less judgmental and much more helpful.
Right. Well, Mike, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I've got a very strong suspicion we're going to talk to each other a bit more throughout the time. And I just want to say thank you for coming on. Is there anything that you'd like to say before I sign off?
I just love speaking to people like you. You've got so much wisdom, and albeit as you when you think back, oh, I didn't enjoy my adolescence, but it's made you who you are.
Yeah.
And I often see some kids who were born into riches and lived a very ostensibly stable and with everything in their adolescence, and the crazy and the mixed up. You know, I do think that the measure of a life is what you make of it, and you're making plenty.
I'm trying to. I've not got long left. That's how it feels anyway. That's how it feels anyway.